I think there's a skill in itself in just understanding the science, but not having to put it all in like deep detail that they know it. Because honestly, not all Wall Street has to know that. But putting it all in the right package, the business thesis and investment thesis. Why should I buy the stock? And then why should I buy it today or not, or sell the stock?
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Careers in Finance. This is a podcast series where we explore conversationally the real stories behind job titles. And today I'm joined by Gabriel Fung, who is actually a longtime friend of mine from high school and also a PhD, perhaps the only one that we'll ever have, first and only of his kind. So, welcome, Gabe.
Thank you, man. Pleasure to be here.
So Gabe has a really interesting background. He's the first, I think, person that I've had on this series where his academic background is quite different. And not just very different, but he's pursued it to the fullest at a PhD level. But today he's in a role in finance, which is very different from what he studied. So that kind of spoils a little bit of my first question that I typically lead in with. But I'm going to ask it anyway, which is, how did you get interested in a career in finance? Your academics were very different from finance. And so did you get your interest from family members early on? Kind of what inspired you?
Uh, that's actually a really funny question, and perhaps I should start with kind of my background to set the foundation for how it got there, because that plays into the story. So it was during my graduate studies. I was actually in the lab. I was a PhD in the Department of Pathology, working on molecular work, but pathology in essence. And at the end of my lab bench, there's actually a computer which I normally work at. The funny part about that is that when I was working at the bench, my boss came in and actually said, I looked at my computer screen and said, "Hey, that's some really cool data. What is that?" Uh, well, what data is that? Like, tell me about it. And I said, "What data?" Because I wasn't looking at data. And so I glanced over at my computer screen, and turns out that was a stock chart. It was a stock chart for some biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies. And I said, "Oh no, that's just a stock chart." I'm always interested as to like what drives valuations for companies like biotech, and especially for some of these biotech companies where R&D takes so long and they're pre-revenue for a decade plus before they actually make money. How do investors think about the valuations for stocks in this space? And how I eventually started to dive a little bit deeper into this was actually when I went back to my computer screen. Eventually, I was looking at the Google Chrome tabs I had open. There were more tabs open that were focused on understanding valuation and business than there was basically publications that are surrounding my work, which was an indication to me that I perhaps had more interest in business than pure academics. That wasn't to say that I was not interested in academics at all. That my goal at that time was actually to become a professor, and had that opportunity to do so, I ultimately realized that that would just be a detour to my, I guess, ultimate career goal, and to understand business would be a key part of that. So I decided to explore that deeper, and that's really how I got into the business side of things from academia. I had never taken a single finance or accounting course till that point, and I was already in my early to mid 20s at that time, and I had no siblings or relatives that were even in the finance or business areas either, or sectors.
How'd you get interested even just in the idea of looking at company valuations? And when you're looking through like companies that are typically, when you're analyzing companies, you're probably looking at public ones, maybe through 10Ks. But as someone that has been in the sciences, I find that I think typically I don't really find many people that would have discussions about company valuations at that point. How did you even get to that point?
Yeah, no, I was actually looking purely at investing and just building wealth and starting early, and that was really kind of where I started. It wasn't focused specifically on biotech, I would say,
Mm.
but given that I was from the science and academic field, I decided to look into that because that was something that I understood. And so when we look at, you can think of any, let's say, tech company or it could even be in consumer, consumer's business. Like, what drives those valuations? And it's a little bit easier and more tangible to understand, in my opinion. But I'm like, okay, so how do I dive deep into this and understand the thesis for why there's something behind a consumer business, or now compared to now a tech business? Like when an AI company comes to us, that you hear all the time, there are many AI companies out there. We find this through AI algorithms. We do this using AI algorithms. How do we sort through the junk there? How do we know which ones are actually good? You kind of need to have a little bit of the industry expertise to be able to look at that and actually make a call. And so I figured that I'll lean into my strengths a little bit from the academic and scientific point of view, that I could help look into then, what's a good drug? How do we understand clinical trials and their readouts, and the mechanism of action, how those drugs are actually working, to then also understand whether or not there is actual meat behind what a company claims on their websites and through their publications.
When you take us through when you finally decided, okay, like I've completed my PhD, I don't think I want to pursue a career in academics, then you had to start applying to jobs and then thinking about moving across to a different country. Um, Take us through what that was like for you, because I would assume it's very kind of stressful to think about, okay, I've spent so much of my life studying this, I thought I wanted to be a professor, and now all of a sudden I'm going to go down a very different path.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of I wouldn't say haters, but naysayers to that thesis, to me going away from the academia, because honestly, I loved it a lot, and luckily I was good at it, and I had the track record to continue to be very successful at it. What happened, I think, was me just having to lean into exactly what I knew what my strengths were. Everyone's career goals are going to be different, and I think I understood that mine wasn't going to be the very typical academic type individual. That I had to kind of stray from the regular path a little bit, and I think when it came to, I guess, growing up in Vancouver, you would very much know that, in my opinion, and anyone can rebuttal this if they like, but Vancouver was kind of narrow-minded, especially at UBC. I think, like, you go into a certain route, a program, you specialize in XYZ. You go in another program, you specialize in XYZ, and that was it. The truth was that I think there was a lot of opportunities out there that are not talked about at a company, at a university like UBC, where there are kind of cross-functional roles. Where your expertise could be very useful in something else. And in my case, it was the science part of it to then investing and business.
Yeah.
And so I had that. I think that was a scary path for me to go out and figure it out on my own. I went and did a lot of mentorships and just cold call discussions with people in different industries that may or may not even be specialized from the scientific point of view, but to ask them and understand what else is out there, just to open up my eyes a little bit. Um, and that's kind of how I landed at a few different paths. One I think is pretty common for people to hear is, one is management consulting, and the other two, one of which was investment banking and equity research. Um, Luckily, I had an opportunity in all three, and I made my decision based off of what I felt was best for me. And the opportunity that was in front of me at that time, to go to New York to explore and try equity research.
Yeah, and it's interesting because people don't necessarily have that exposure right away, where you don't realize that in university you can pursue whatever that you are most interested in, that you're most passionate about, and hopefully you end up pursuing something that you love so much that you would then, not necessarily, not many people do this, but that you would pursue a PhD in, because ultimately I find finance is so it serves so many different interests. Like, for example, like having a background in biology is perfect if you want to cover, let's say you're in traditional investment banking, healthcare sector. That's a great place to be because they specifically seek out people with that type of academic experience because it's not easy to understand. For example, like going into industry coverage in healthcare with my background, which is a general business management degree, a commerce degree, that would be very difficult for me to understand. In metals and mining, if you don't come from an engineering background or a geography background, it's very difficult to understand the operating model of the business and the actual business itself and the resource. So it's really interesting to see that it wasn't as accessible for you in university to know, like, hey, I could do this. And if I want to go get a job in finance, it's perfectly complementary.
Yeah, that's right. I did seek a lot of help, discussions from career counselors and other resources that were at UBC. That is, didn't find it all that helpful in my opinion. But maybe just because the way that the things that I was looking for may have not been there at that point, but maybe in other industries they're there.
And one thing I know just from knowing you is that something that I think is really interesting is that academics, particularly at the PhD level and wanting to become a professor, is highly competitive, and it's very similar to running a business where you kind of are the business itself. And so, coming from a very academic background lends itself very well to going into finance because it is kind of at the heart of it very competitive. Would you
Yeah,
still
yeah.
stand by that statement?
Yeah, there are definitely some translatable skills I think there between running your own research laboratory, asking the relevant scientific questions and going at it with the limited resources, and same thing in finance to ask the right questions and to go ahead and say like um, to be able to drive that program to actually end up at a full recommendation so that the business can succeed, I think is there are some translatable skills there. Clearly in a different setting, but definitely there's some skills there.
Okay, so then I would love to get your like take us back to when you first landed your role in equity research. You have generally equity research from my knowledge. I have pretty good experience with it because I used to work in debt capital markets. It's an intense job. There's a lot of data analysis. There's a lot of Excel. There's a lot of financial statement analysis. Could have long hours, particularly during earnings season. How did you adjust to that? And did you find that you were kind of prepared day one on the job to do the literal tasks every single day to be able to do all that data analysis in Excel, to access all the information in Bloomberg? There's just like so much skills that typically are like learned on the job. And I'm curious what your experience was like.
Yeah, there was a lot to be learned on the job. I think what when I was interviewing for these equity research roles, what I ultimately came to find is that I think I needed to have a baseline of just industry expertise and specialization that made sense to that specific role because I covered a very unique sector within healthcare, that is. But on top of that, I think the groups were just willing to invest in my profile in terms of my work ethics. To show the grit that I think that was needed for this type of role. And same thing with capital markets and banking. Um, it is long hours, and to show them that I guess I had the thirst and the need to and the want to prove that I'm more than just a benchtop scientist. And that was, I think, what they were, in my opinion, what the company or the bank was actually investing in me. That is, what they found the most attractive. And for me, that was kind of a scary experience. I don't think I fully understood that I'm what it took to be successful right away, and at the same time, I don't think I was fully prepared for it either. And I think it's really hard for me to understand that. I think almost impossible because again, I haven't taken a single accounting class in my life or finance class, and going into this role, it was like, okay, I generally know how to use Excel and build financial models and so on, but like I never had the right training to feel validated in that. I can do what I want, but I don't know if I'm doing the same mistake constantly over and over again. And so going into it, for me, how I really tackled it was, when I moved to New York for that, I dedicated every single second of my day from morning till night to just be open-minded to all the work that needed to be done that's in the actual job at the office. But in addition to that, I went into all those securities exams that you would need for equity research, to with basically like a very, very humble mind that, telling myself that, I don't know these things, but I can learn today. Going in and ROI meant something very different to me. From a scientific point of view, that was a region of interest as opposed to return on investment, right? And what does fair value mean? What does all those kind of things? And to really just go into understand all the fundamentals, and to tell myself every day when after I finish the 12+ hour workday, to then go home, or I personally went to a hotel lobby that was like a lounge, and I just studied there. It was just easier for me to stay focused, and to study, for a few more hours every day until I got my exams done. And I was telling myself, um, I've done a lot more things, harder things than just learn some, accounting and finance. So why not put a few more hours here for the next few months to get these and bang these exams out?
Oh my God, what a very mature thing to do.
I think it was I had to be like that. Honestly, I think I was forced to be like that, because if it wasn't, then I'd probably lose my visa and have to go back to Canada, and not be able to explore that part of my interest, that is. So I really did force myself into it, but at the same time, like, I liked it, so it wasn't hard in that sense. I really do think someone's gonna like what they do to put themselves through a work hours of 12 to 14 hours a day, and then afterwards, study for
Study
another
on
3 or 4 hours.
top of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where probably there's a lot of transferable skills and passions between academics and equity research, which is like a lot of just learning and being passionate about learning and being able to dedicate yourself to like all the milestones that are involved, passing series, whatever exams, and
Yeah.
potentially doing the CFA, all that kind of stuff. You've done a lot more challenging things typically when you have pursued a PhD than really any exam in finance.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I really agree with that. So I think just being a lifelong learner, sum it up like that,
Yeah.
continue to be a lifelong learner. And to be able to kind of shift to where the market's moving, but also where my own interests are moving, to continue to just be happy, to stay sane, and to, be a valuable contributor to society.
And so take us from your very first job in finance to where you are today, and kind of maybe tell us some of the high points and the lower points that you experienced.
Yeah, that's a great question. So for those that don't know, of course, I started in equity research after my PhD. I spent about 5 years there, but I today work in corporate development, or some people call it corporate development, business development, but primarily buy side. And I'll get to that in a moment. But starting back at after my graduate studies and in equity research, low days were primarily just when I think when, if I made a mistake at work, sometimes it would be really tough to swallow, because I think, just explaining the 12 to 14 hours of work and then on top of that studying, it could really be draining. And I was there by myself. I moved to New York without a single other network. It was just, was no one to really call on other than an actual virtual phone call. But even
Oh
time
my
zone
gosh,
difference
you should
made
have
it
told
different.
me.
Yeah.
I know this is like a bit of an aside, but I wish you would have
Right.
told me. Then I could have at least set you up from with some UBC students that were in finance
Over there.
that worked there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I probably could have also done more to go seek more help. I think those were also my rough days, and I just tell myself, like, there's, no excuses, just success. I got to just continue to put my head down. I honestly think that the work and the work ethic, the long hours, and even just studying was not even the hardest part. In my personal opinion, the hardest part to all that was when you spend that much time with those people at work, especially the small teams, right? In equity research, um, you really, really, really got to enjoy working with your manager and your teammates. And even if you do, you also want to make sure that you guys have the right chemistry in every way, not just like on the pure content of the work, but also just like from a friendship level, personal level.
Yeah,
And
you have
I
to be
think
able to
that,
joke and be able to kind of talk about stuff
yeah,
that's in the news and like basically bring up any topic that's not work related so that you're able to kind of like keep your sanity because you're there for like 12 hours, right?
yeah, yeah. These people ultimately become your family then at time. Like they you're immersed with them every day. Um, And when they text and call and need help, or the other way around, like you do expect on both sides immediate responses, as you know, also from the banking sector. Um, so I think that was my hardest time, because I think I put myself in situations in the past where I didn't have the best chemistry with my teammates or managers, and I just needed to put that aside and just keep grinding through it. And that's just the nature, of things. Now, not everyone's going to have a good manager or a good boss in any industry, and so I just need to be humble about that and tell myself that I'm not alone in this. I just gotta
Yeah,
I
and
gotta
like
keep
that's
cranking at that.
and it's so hard, especially in the beginning, because when you're looking for your first job in equity research or your first job in capital markets, first job in M&A, those jobs are hard to come by as it is. Like for every like 100 applicants, maybe you'll have one get an interview, and then eventually it's like of the 10 from the 1,000 resumes, you're going to hire one. So you're not going to get to
Yeah,
choose. You're not going to go in there and be like, oh, I'm going to be really picky about like which investment bank I work for.
yeah,
You're applying for Goldman Sachs and you get a job, then that's great. Like that's all that matters. And it's really luck of the draw. You'd be extremely fortunate, I think, in your career to be able to work with really amazing people that you respect, admire, and want to emulate from day one. And I think it's really important to actually go through the challenging pieces earlier on in your life and be able to work with people that you don't see eye to eye with, who you would rather not be sitting for 12, 14 hours a day with, and to be able to learn how to like tolerate that, but not even tolerate that, but just to be able to be your best self throughout that type of situation and learn how to navigate those scenarios early on, I think sets you up for a ton of success in the future. To be able to learn those tough lessons and go through that kind of hardship process when you are not married, don't have children, don't have huge financial obligations, makes it a lot easier.
yeah. You brought a lot of good points there. I think that those skills are very useful for anyone in any industry. Of course, not just in the banking or in equity research, but especially when you spend X amount of hours with someone any day, for every day. Anywhere. It could be like a roommate. Like if you don't have the right roommate, it could make your life a lot harder, right? But it can also make your life a lot better when you do have the right one. And so, I admit that when I went in, it was tougher for me, because like I just had to accept the fact that if I didn't put up with this, that I would lose my visa. And so it was harder for me to just think that, oh, I can just go to another bank right in the beginning, especially when I still haven't really completed my exams yet, like that kind of thing. It was I haven't really fully proven to Wall Street that I was just more than just a benchtop scientist. I think that was where it was the hardest. Afterwards, I think when I built my reputation both with the buy side and of course sell side, when opportunities did come, uh, it's I think the biggest thing I've heard from the recruiters, or even the straight up hiring managers that reached out to me directly, um, what my value proposition was, that they want another um, a, how to say, a scientific PhD that could both do the science part of it, but also the finance part of it, and they didn't want to have to teach someone that, because I think they have found a lot of PhDs. They can hire PhDs or MDs from different universities. A lot of them couldn't get themselves out of the mindset that they are in academics and academia. That they to go to how to say. I think there's a skill in itself in just understanding the science, but not having to put it all in like deep detail that they know it. Because honestly, not all Wall Street has to know that. Is packaging, putting it all in the right package, the business thesis and investment thesis. Why should I buy the stock? And then why should I buy it today or not, or sell the stock? Why should I sell it later or today? Right. And how do you put numbers behind that without having to get into the details, because there's just so much information nowadays. And I think that skill set was ultimately what had me being able to kind of flip the table, in a sense that later in my career in equity research, when I did have opportunities come in front of me, I got to pick and choose. And I was choosing between managers, so to say, at that point, and the banks, um, mostly because I've already proven to myself and the street that I can do both the science and the finance piece of it, and that I think that this profile is relatively rare.
And okay, that leads me to the question of I think more technical sectors require generally more academic backgrounds. But what do you think is more difficult to learn? The sector, which is for you in bioscience, or okay, what is the right terminology? Is it
Um,
bio?
Technology or
Okay,
biopharma.
biotechnology.
Yeah,
I'm going to redo that.
sure.
Okay, so what do you think is more difficult to teach from coming from a very technical sector, biotech or equity research, like the skill set behind that? Like, what do you think is harder to teach someone?
Um, Biotech.
Yeah.
And I say that because uh, I guess a short way of summarizing what I'm about to say is that it's easier to teach a scientist some business than it is to teach a business person some science. And so that's why, in my opinion, it's easier for a scientist to come onto Wall Street and to learn the business side of things than the other way around. For someone that's maybe a generalist or anywhere else in the let's say in the finance kind of background to then go in and jump into biotech and say and look at a drug and be like, well, what does this mean?
Yeah.
What does that mean? And then ROI means something very different to them, right? Um, so it's a little bit harder in that sense. When you read an academic paper, the language in itself, of course, is English, but the way that they talk, the vocabulary, it's very different from uh, um, any other thing you would read. It takes a lot of practices to understand how an academic paper reads, and to really quickly know where to look. What to look for, what kind of language is, gives you red flags, that kind of thing. Whereas I think a business person it would be harder for them to learn that piece.
And so after you went through the almost like initiation, so to speak, which is that hard work, passing those
Yeah,
exams, and the really kind of tough I would say the first like 3 to 5 years in your career in finance is really, really challenging. It requires just a lot of dedication. Basically, your personal life is like not super existent at that point. But
yeah,
after going through and making your way through that chapter, um, how did you end up where you are today?
yeah. Actually, I think I would say that about 3 year time frame, I realized that um, in finance, at least for at least my field in biotech, and I think this is broadly applicable to other industries as well. Uh, that about 3 years in, if you don't want to be a long-term equity research analyst, big name, big bank, that kind of thing, doing more than 3 years doesn't really help all that much. You've learned all the translatable skills to bring you to something else, and those something else can be packaged, in my opinion, in two or three different ways. And that's when I realized. So I had to answer, that's the fork in the road for me. Ask the question to myself: do I want to stay in equity research? Do I want to stay in or not? I think that's the first question: yes or no. And the answer was no. Equity research was not going to be the end goal. I really liked my manager and the team and the bank that I was at that time. So I spent 2 more years there to a total of about 5 years in equity research, just to hone in. I think that was like the execution phase. I think I was just executed very well in those last 2 to 3 years. But then when I answered the question for myself, like, no, it's not going to help me that much more to stay in equity research at this point, then what are those other options? And the other options, in my opinion, for at least specifically for me, one which is there was one that could go to actual banking, again, stay in the finance side of it,
Yeah,
go to
I know that's
banking.
like it's kind of a
Yeah,
backwards thing. Typically, people end up like start off at industry group and then okay, they look maybe about capital markets, but you don't really see
yeah,
the reverse happening.
yeah.
But it was an
Funny.
option. It's not like a super attractive option, but it is an option.
It is, yeah, it wasn't, and it wasn't an option. It wasn't an attractive option. Yes, you're right. Another one was then to go to banking. Sorry, not bank, buy side. So that's any of things like from venture and hedge funds, um,
PE, everything in between.
PE, right? Everything between. Just like exploring all those different options, and you kind of like, what's your style? You can kind of go to those ones. So I just generally bucket that as buy side. And then, in my opinion, the last option, then the third option is corporate. And when I mean corporate, some people go to straight into like things like FP&A roles, and some people go into investor relation roles. Some people go into corporate development roles.
Mhm.
So there's different buckets within that too. And And I asked myself and had the very honest conversations, like, what do I like about this job the most, and do I plan to stay on, in finance, so to say. Um, the first question, do I plan to stay in finance, would help me eliminate the first two answers, right? Banking and like basically buy side. And I said, no, I don't plan to stay in finance.
Oh,
But
interesting.
what do I like about the most about this job, and what fits to my personal needs? Part of this is actually like, me navigating this with my own personal needs, which was, my wife had moved to New York with me. And so, if I was working 14 hours a day, it was very, she left her whole family and friend circle to come here. So my point around is that, to be respectful of that, but also because I don't care to be working 14, 15 hours a day, especially at that kind of that pace. I needed to kind of shift out of finance too. So that was a part of my decision as well. So finance wasn't the thing, but what did I like about the most about kind of now being kind of in between the science part of it and then like the financial part of it? And the answer that I landed on was that I really enjoyed um, strategic transactions the most. When I mean strategic transactions, it could be partnerships, it could be corporate venture, it could be also M&A. Doing those and guiding and advising on those were, in my opinion, the most important and most exciting parts about the job. Um, so I started looking at a corporate, and then within corporate, I eliminated investor relations because you don't do any of that kind of stuff there. But then I kept looking into corporate development and business development type work, transaction partnerships, that kind of thing. And so that's how I ended up going now into the corporate development route. And I said, why not? I mean, of course, it has to be a science company that I'm going to lean into. And so I worked at first this company called 10x Genomics. That's a how to say, it's a laboratory tool, a very innovative one, a very very good. I think, in my opinion, from a scientific point of view, a lot of good information that can come out of that type of technology. And I was doing M&A and strategic partnerships for 10x Genomics. Through time, their coffers started to dry up a little bit, and so my role started to shift towards alliance management, and how that ended up was just like, this is not interesting. I didn't leave finance and take a massive pay cut to just do alliance management now. And so I had the opportunity to, then I was referred to a company called Exact Sciences. And if anyone's listening to this from in America, you think about those commercials for a product called Cologuard. It's a diagnostic, it's a screening. So basically helps patients screen for colorectal cancer. There's other parts to this too, but that's that's their main product that they sell in the industry. And here at Exact Sciences, I lead corporate development for a part of a division called Precision Oncology. Um, so focused again on M&A and strategic transactions, and also when there are opportunities for venture investments, I also do those.
And so, to this point in your career and everything that we've chatted about so far, I think that you're going to come off as maybe one of the most well planned, pregnant, and pragmatic with your career. And it sounds like you've really got everything sort of figured out. And so, with that said, I'm curious, what do you think your career will look like in 5 to 10 years?
Uh, I don't know if I've figured it out, so to say, but I do think I know I've landed on something that I really, really enjoy. I
It's a good
honestly really like
balance.
my work. Yeah, that has a good balance, not just between my own personal life, in corporate development and business development. There's ebbs and flows of work. Sometimes it is a lot of work. It just, when you have a live deal going on or multiple live deals, just like it is like in banking, like you're crunching all the time, 14, 15-hour days. And then sometimes there's it's just there's not much going on, and the whole industry is starting to fall apart, or like political things change it and make it so that there's not much work to do for a little bit, and you start to look for different opportunities. And it's a little bit more of proactively thinking about how do we shift work now, as opposed to like having to work on a live deal, and there's more time to do the other, the former there. um uh I really, I think that's worked very well for me in business development. um I'm sorry, what your initial question was?
Where do you think you'll
Lost
be
my train
in
of thought.
like five to ten
Oh, yes.
years?
Right. And then so in 5 to 10 years, I still see myself walking a similar path. But what does that mean, at least for business development? I think when you think about like when people go into certain industries or roles, like whether it's banking or corporate development, or whatever it may be, they generally have like they might think of it like a stepping stone. And they know exactly where that gets them to. In business development, it's not entirely clear what generally comes next for anyone that might want to move on from corporate development or business development type roles at some point. Some people go on to become a chief business officer. Some people just go on to leading a division or becoming a general manager of a division. In 5 to 10 years, what I think is um, reasonable for me, at least, or let's say 5 years, being let's say like a VP of a division in the BD role, that is, makes sense. I'd be very happy with that. Um, if there was a very exciting opportunity that came along to let's say like be a GM of a smaller business, I would absolutely love that. But I honestly think I still have a lot more learning to get there. Just being humbly speaking, that is. I think on the 10-year time frame, that's probably much more attainable. Some people become chief business officers of their respective businesses. In this case, this company doesn't have a chief business officer, but that doesn't mean that role can't be created at some point
Created.
as
Yeah.
well. Yeah, because in some ways that we did have one. I mean, actually, we didn't officially have that title, but there were different roles that in the C-suite level that did encompass almost entirely the BD type function. There could be an opportunity there, and that, in my opinion, that's up to for me to uh, control the controllables. And if it means that I can convince the business to create that role for me at some point, then yes. But as of right now, that doesn't exist for the business. Um, yeah, they have other functions. I think it's kind of been consolidated to a few different roles that are you wouldn't think that they have BD, but they do kind of overlook kind of my position here.
And on I think a great way to wrap up our podcast, because you've had such a good breadth as well as depth of experience. All of our listeners are going to be from various different parts of the world and various different parts of their career. But at your current stage, with all of the experience that you've had, if you could give someone that is uh, thinking of transitioning from academics or some very different line of work into equity research, what would be your kind of like nugget of advice you would give them?
I would say go in with the best attitude possible. And the reason why I say that is because when you have the best attitude, I think you immediately already have a leg up on not that it's a competition, but on your colleagues that are going to be fighting for that same position at some point when you want to become the VP of your team in equity research or own your own coverage universe. You really need to go in with a good attitude and manage up, in my opinion. And I think that's an opportunity. That's a skill set that applies again to all careers, wherever you are. Manage your team if you have a team that reports into you, but also manage up to manage your own boss and also their colleagues to the point where they already see that you're doing their job for them, so that they can more or less at some point when the opportunity comes promote you into those roles. I would say go in with an opportunity to take every opportunity to demonstrate your skill sets as best as possible.
And I can't think of anything else to say that it's going to allow us to wrap up our podcast on a higher note. And so thank you so much, Gabe, for joining me on our podcast today. For those of you listening, I hope that this has given you a really unique perspective on how finance really welcomes people of all sorts of different backgrounds. And maybe if you are in biology, you've been able to see yourself represented in finance. So until next time, I will see you later.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. FinPod is brought to you by Corporate Finance Institute, the #1 rated online provider of finance and banking training, certifications, and productivity tools.